Right. I think we'll go ahead and get started and then others will join as we go. But thank you all for dialing in today to our Navigating Market Access with Magnolia webinar series. I'm Amanda Fories. I'm the managing partner, and Tracy Baroni-Allman and Brendan Schnee have joined as well. And today we're going to be talking about the main topic is the Congressional Budget Office scoring, kind of a 201 on that. But of course, it's been kind of a crazy couple weeks in Washington, D.C. So we thought we would start and kind of kick us off with a little bit of an economic and policy update. Just for those of you joining in that would like to hear a little bit of what we know and what we're thinking. I think there's still a lot of unknowns. So next month's webinar will be focused a bit more on these topics, but we'll dive into them a little bit today. But just to give a quick little overview of our team. So here on the phone, as I mentioned, Tracy Baroni-Allman is our Vice President of Market Access and Policy. She comes to us with a lot of experience in industry and has been working in market access and policy for years. And she's had a lot of interaction with the federal agencies that we're going to be talking about. So I think we've got quite a bit from Tracy today that will be helpful. Brendan Schnee joined us almost a year ago. He has a background in global health economics and has been working on budget scoring with me a lot since joining the company. And I thought it'd be really fun today to have him join the webinar to talk about kind of the experience of what you do as CBO versus what we do in our industry when we're meeting with payers or kind of talking through when you all are going in front as customers, let's say in front of payers or hospital audiences and showing budget impact models and talking about value of product or value of industry. So kind of seeing his angle from that and how things are different with Congressional Budget Office scoring, I think is a pretty fascinating difference. So we're going to hear from him a bit. So just to give you the outline, like I said, we're going to do a quick policy outlook, and then we'll talk about CBO scoring. We're going to talk about our approach to kind of rethinking it or how we like to interact with the Congressional Budget Office. I think a lot of people here, I don't mean to date myself, but a lot of us probably saw the Schoolhouse Rocks, How a Bill Becomes a Law video, which I like to refer to a lot. But you don't think about all the agencies that are actually involved in policymaking and what those agencies are thinking and their influence on what actually gets passed in Washington, D.C. And there was never a section of that on the Congressional Budget Office. It was really just showing everybody on Capitol Hill, but all the things that actually where the sausage is ground and how it turns out has a lot to do with the CBO. They kind of, give the score or the budget for a policy that can kill it or help things move along. So they're a very important office. And we'll talk about kind of what you can do to better engage with them or how you should think about your relationship with CBO. You could definitely have the Facebook status of it's complicated with CBO, but we'll talk through what that means. We'll also talk a little bit about some of their scoring on where we think they've done things right and where we think there's ways that they could potentially think a little bit differently about our industry when they're developing scores. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Tracy, who's going to spend about 10 minutes on just a policy update for you all, and then we'll take some questions on this before we hop into the CBO portion. So Tracy, the floor is yours.
Perfect. Thanks, Amanda, and welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us. We're going to start our discussion by thinking about how policy change actually happens. And most specifically, we're going to talk a little bit more about executive orders. President Trump has signed over 150 executive orders during his second term, including over 140 within the first 100 days. Because some recent executive orders, or EOs, as you'll hear me refer to them, have focused on the drug industry, we wanted to review the instrument and then also some of the content of those orders. Unlike statutes, executive orders are derived solely from one branch of government. Not surprisingly, that's the executive branch, and the power granted to the head of that branch by Article 2 of the Constitution. However, the U.S. Constitution does not have a provision that specifically permits the use of executive orders. And so because of that, we've had to rely on a Supreme Court decision that actually says that executive orders from the president must be supported by the Constitution, whether from a clause granting him specific power or by Congress delegating that power to the executive branch. Attempts to block such orders have been successful at times when such orders either exceed the authority of the president or could be better handled through legislation. And so what that basically boils down to is executive orders cannot violate the Constitution, They cannot override existing laws passed by Congress, and they cannot infringe on the powers reserved to other branches of the government, whether that be Congress or the judiciary. And what we're also seeing now is that executive orders can be challenged in court if they're unconstitutional or exceeding the presidential authority, overturned by Congress through legislation, or revoked or modified by a future president. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. There we go. Thanks.
Sorry, it's a
This
little
slide,
delayed.
sorry. This slide gives a brief overview of the only tariff power that is actually given to the president, Section 232 power. Other than a situation where there is a potential national security threat, tariff power rests clearly with Congress. And so while this Congress has ceded that power to President Trump as he has invoked various tariffs, the president chose to use the power that has actually been granted to him under Section 232 to determine if tariffs on the pharma industry are appropriate. You may recall that in President Trump's first term, he imposed tariffs on the steel industry under Section 232 authority. In 2021, a challenge to that by Prime Source Building Products was initially upheld as a result of a technical issue or a missed deadline by the administration. But then that decision was actually overturned in 2023 by the U.S. Court of Appeals, which ruled that the president was within his authority to utilize the tariffs as part of a contingency plan to address national security concerns that had been uncovered. And so since that time, and at that time, the U.S. Supreme Court has declined to hear appeals in multiple cases challenging the Section 232 tariffs, including a similar case that was denied Supreme Court review in March 2023, and this actual case, the Prime Building case, which was denied Supreme Court review in October 2023 as well. So all this to say that a tariff based on a national security threat related to U.S. steel can be upheld, then it seems reasonable that a similar claim could be upheld and the court would rule against the industry if it were to challenge any finding of a Section 232 investigation and the need for a tariff. Next slide, please. One of the most prolific orders that early came down in the term was the lowering drug prices by once again putting America first. There are several provisions, not even all of them on this slide, but some of the key ones on this slide that were included in that EO that actually will impact the industry. The ones that I would just like to call out now, alignment of timing for small molecules and biologics for negotiation under the IRA. This is important because while at one point it seemed like this would be a way to increase the time for the small molecules before they were negotiated, identified for negotiation, they could also bring the biologics back to the timeline that is used for small molecules. So it's hard to say what this looks like. Maybe they find a place in the middle, but it's clear that he's been listening and paying attention that there is a discrepancy there. Another interesting part of this order is researching and reporting on anti-competitive behavior by pharma manufacturers. So over the years, we've seen lots of things being raised as potentially anti-competitive behavior. It could be pay for delay. It could be scrutiny of mergers and acquisitions. It could include citizens petitions, which we hear about fairly frequently as well. So we're not sure what this looks like, but regardless of which issue they pick, there are a lot to choose from, and it's probably not going to be a positive thing for the industry. Next slide, please. So the industry has been evolving, and active pharmaceutical ingredients and manufacturing has been moving out of the United States to other countries for at least the past 25 or 30 years. I mean, as of 2021, the FDA said that about 13% of APIs or active pharmaceutical ingredients manufacturing facilities were located in the United States. So that means that a vast majority are located outside of the United States. India and China together account for nearly 40% of foreign facilities, with India slightly ahead and China producing larger volumes. And so there's a lot of ex-US production. Um, and so if we think about how we're going to look at production, it almost seems like this order is a little bit too late because you can't move production back onshore overnight or even within 3 or 4 years. Next slide, please. Arguably one of the most consequential orders impacting the pharmaceutical industry was issued on May 12th, delivering most favored nation status to American patients. And following the announcement of the EO on May 12th, with an edict for HHS to determine a price based on foreign drug pricing that would be assigned to manufacturers by drug, there was another announcement on May 20th where the price was accelerated and in timing. And it was actually identified that this would apply, the way the price would be calculated would be any OECD country with a GDP of at least 60% of the per capita US GDP. And so what that basically equates to is the US nominal per capita GDP is just over $89,000. 60% of that is a little bit over $53,000. The countries that would be included, there's at least 22 of them from what I can see. And so it not only includes countries like Germany, Italy, and France, which use the same approval process and similar negotiation processes, it would also include countries that have vastly different systems for both approval, coverage, and price negotiation, like Singapore, Israel, and Hong Kong. So it's important to recognize that that basket, while it might have GDP in common, doesn't necessarily have much else in common. And so because all drugs and channels seem to be included in the MFN, it's an understatement to say that significant changes are going to be required to implement this. Next slide, please. It's important to recognize, I don't want to review this whole slide, but it's important to recognize that as we're thinking about changes to pricing, there are also going to be changes to drug approval with a new administration, the new heads of the FDA and HHS. It's also important to recognize that PDUFA is due to be renewed, and recent statements from newly appointed senior officials within the FDA have indicated that there's a belief that the public might not be comfortable with PDUFA industry fees paying for a significant portion of the FDA budget. And yet, if you're going to cut their budget by 18.6% to start, looking at more cuts in the future, the PDUFA negotiations no doubt will be quite interesting. PDUFA needs to be renewed by September 30th of 2027. And the first meeting to have those discussions has been scheduled, the first public meeting for July of this summer. Next slide, please. My last slide is really the wrap-up slide. And I think the only couple of things that we maybe haven't talked about are the last two columns, patients and 340B. We know that the House just passed a budget in the middle of the night, and we know that there are significant Medicaid changes. Even if just some of them are enacted ultimately once the Senate reviews and amends the bill that comes to them, there's likely to be significant changes in Medicaid, significant loss of people off the rolls of Medicaid. Similarly, ACA tax credits could also be impacted. And so we're looking at probably anywhere from 13 to 15 million people potentially who are going to be uninsured, which of course impacts the industry. It impacts all of healthcare because more people in the ER, less preventive care, all of those things that the ACA created for us. And then finally, I just want to touch quickly on 340B, recognizing that a recent court decision looked at the decisions by certain manufacturers to turn 340B into more of a rebate program for certain drugs that were going to be selected drugs and have negotiated prices. So they did not end up double dipping on those products where they would get an MFP rebate and a 340B discount. And that was actually, the ruling was in the entity's favor, saying that without HRSA approval of that type of an arrangement, that the manufacturers could not put that in place. And so there's going to be significant work needed for manufacturers to work with CMS and HRSA to ensure that those double dip rebates haven't occurred. And so with that, I will turn it over to Amanda and Brendan.
Great, thanks so much, Tracy. If you have questions, you can go ahead and put them in the Q&A or in the chat. We'd be happy to address them. Some we might just hold for the end, but if any pop up, we'll try to get them as we go as well. So thank you. All right, so definitely a lot of TBD, right, for us in this space right now. But we're, like I said, our next webinar, we will focus a lot on how these things have kind of played out over the past month, and be sure to be working with our clients and friends on figuring out what to do next. So thank you. All right, so it is time to talk about CBO budget scoring. So anyone who's worked with me knows that I get very giddy when we get to talk about data or interacting with the federal government, and the combination of the two is amazing. So I'm very excited to get into this today. I think the CBO, like I said earlier, is kind of an underrated agency in terms of its relative importance to policy and what actually happens in this world and how things get through up in Washington, D.C. So I'd like to talk a little bit about kind of their role and what you can do to interact with them. So as I mentioned, some people here, you've met with CBO a bunch, and maybe you're just interested in learning a little bit differently about it. Others, this might be a completely new topic. So please do not hesitate to ask questions. So just to kind of level set what the CBO, so it was established in 1974 as an independent, nonpartisan agency. Technically, they're nonpartisan. The OMB, the Office of Management Budget, that is a political budgeting office that's associated with the president's office and group. So that's administration dependent. CBO is technically nonpartisan. I think it's hard to get nonpartisan work in Washington, D.C., so they are definitely going to have their biases just naturally in the work that they see in the legislation that comes out. I have met with them on behalf of pharmaceutical companies. I've met with them on behalf of insurers. I've met with them on behalf of patient groups and different groups. They have a lot of biases. It's just naturally the way that you're going to walk into a conversation with them. They will push back and forth, and some conversations can be adversarial because they definitely have their opinions of the way that our industry works. So just walking into them, it is not impartial. No matter what side of the aisle you sit on, you're not always going to get what you want from the CBO or get them to completely understand your position. They do have a very important role. Like I said, I think it's highly underrated how important this agency is. They have a huge influence on policy and if things move through in DC. Usually, back in the day when I started doing scoring work, which I don't want to admit how many years ago that is, we mentioned to clients, if you have a score that's, in a couple hundred millions of dollars over 10 years, that's a pretty decent score. Like if you can say under the billion in a 10-year score. If you can be a cost savings score, that's amazing, right? That's really hard to do. But when we do a score and try to think the way that the CBO thinks, clients aren't always happy, right? They're not happy to see the way the Congressional Budget Office is going to score their policy. So your job is to really understand how they're going to think about policy and how they should think about policy, because they are very influential. They have a very pivotal role in giving policy analysis, but also putting out baselines about the way the economy's going to move. There's an IRA paper that they've put out of how many products they think are going to leave the pipeline. We'll talk about that a little bit later. So they're not just looking at this law and how the spend might happen. They're keeping the baselines, all the projections for the future, and also doing some forward-looking economic analysis. So meeting with CBO. So we attend a lot of meetings with the CBO on behalf of our clients. We are not lobbyists here. We're kind of the technical experts that come in to talk through a score. So when a client meets with them, they'll come together either as an individual manufacturer, it'll be a patient group, it could be working with their bill sponsors on the Hill, but they'll come together and meet with CBO. So often you'll show up with your sponsor, their staff, your team or your association group, a couple interested parties, and you'll come into the call and kind of kick it off and start through your issue. And then you'll generally turn it over to somebody technical to talk through the scoring work that you've done. And that person is supposed to be a nonpartisan, unbiased person, right? So that's our role as a consultant, to walk in and talk through our scores that we've tried to think through from all different angles, and we're not lobbyists. So we go to those meetings, we meet with them on behalf of our clients, either if they're wanting to inform them about something that they know is coming up, or maybe they weren't in love with the previous score and they think that there's a lot of points that should be discussed, or they're putting together legislation and they want to kind of talk through the parameters and what those things might mean. And one of the points I wanted to put down here in the blue box, a very important reminder, the CBO is an accounting office. There's people with accounting backgrounds, economic backgrounds, people who've been in government agencies for years. They don't think like we think, right? All of us who've been in industry or at patient assistant groups and have been boots on the ground, they don't understand really the way that the market truly works. They try, they read tons of reports, they read tons of publications, they'll cite a million different things that come out to you when you're meeting with them, but they haven't necessarily been in industry. And if you think about it, you're coming to them potentially with a very sophisticated and complicated ask, but they might have also just had somebody coming in wanting alcohol to be, legal for people ages 8 and over. So they get all sorts of different people with all sorts of different requests coming in. So they're going to be very questioning of what your policy is, and it's your job to educate them on the way your industry works. And because they get a lot of very strange requests, I think coming in and being as professional and courteous as you can with them, but also presenting as much of a transparent discussion as you can to them, will buy you so much more in the end than coming in, talking about an issue, not putting numbers in front of them, not being transparent. I think it makes a huge difference. So coming in and really establishing your credibility, that you've done your homework, that you've anticipated what they've read, what they've seen, you're able to address questions, you're able to follow up with more detail if you can't. I think it's really important because your job is to get them to understand your position, right? And to really think through what a law is going to do and how a score could really influence it, and how to really think about what's going to happen if X is passed, what Y is influenced, and what will end up happening. Okay. So how does the CBO generally think? And this is one of those conversations, the bottom orange, it says static versus dynamic. I think a lot of people love to say, oh, the Congressional Budget Office, they only think statically. So if everybody goes and gets a welcome to Medicare test screening, when they join Medicare and there's a $5 test, multiply that $5 test by how many people get a welcome to Medicare screening, and that's how much a policy is going to cost. A lot of people think CBO only thinks that way. They do sometimes. They are pretty static because they don't always have the understanding of how everything's going to go. But sometimes they do think about offsets, right? Sometimes they understand that if you catch 10 people with heart disease or 100,000 people with heart disease at that welcome to Medicare visit, you could reduce some hospitalizations later down the road. They do try to take into account some of that. It's not going to be to the level of detail as Brendan's going to talk in a few minutes about what we do in our health economics scoring, but they do understand that if you do one thing in Part D, or shift something over from D to B, or put something into a policy that's going to increase rebates or increase costs, they do get something's going to happen. They just don't necessarily know how to quantify that all the time. So their job is to look at, what do we think the baseline scoring is going to be? How do we think the policy is going to change that baseline? And they're in a huge rush, right? They're getting a lot of pressure. They have to score the bills as quickly as they can. They're trying to make some standard assumptions, and they're trying to use some public data if they can. They have standard growth rates. They're just kind of fitting something into their mold. And if they haven't gone in and done one of those forward-looking or back-end deeper studies on the dynamic pieces of that industry, they're not going to put that into a score. It's just not possible for them. And I get frustrated with it every time I'll look at a score, because you can see on their website, they don't really give you the transparent score. They give you a line, but they're not giving you all the inputs. You have to kind of guess. So when you're in a meeting with them, you should be asking them like, oh, how did you guys think about that? Or, hey, here's how we thought about this. We're curious if that aligns with the way that you think about it. And sometimes that's the only way You're going to get a methodological input from them, because you're not going to be able to do a FOIA request and get something in a week from CBO that you're going to need for something happening in DC. So it's up to you to really have that back and forth discussion to understand, are they thinking statically and dynamically? Or how could I get them to think a little bit more dynamically by explaining to them the way that the world works in this policy? So you're going to definitely see some of those standard assumptions. We try to capture those and think about those. But your goal is to really help them think about how to understand the offsets of a policy, or how something's going to really influence the whole marketplace. So I put down at the bottom, their equation is cost times volume, or savings times volume. Sometimes you'll get an offset, but it's very inconsistent. So I wouldn't say that they're static all the time. I would say they're sometimes dynamic, mostly static. Don't think it's something that could always be fixed easily. But I also think it's up to us to try to influence that as much as we can. Okay. So what I'd like now is I'm going to turn it over to Brendan, because I'd like him to talk about his experience of the work he's done for years, right? Looking at the way that we do this kind of work in our world and how the CBO should be thinking. So Brendan, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So I guess I'll start talking about offsets a little bit. So as Amanda was talking about, the CBO does sometimes think dynamically with their scores, but I think it's important, based on my experience doing health economics work for many years, that they should look for more potential offsets and incorporate those into the scores. So that can come in the form of outcomes. If a patient is going to be cured faster, or whatever the case may be there, what is the impact that would have on cost? And similarly, the potential impact on the healthcare resource utilization. If you spend one less day in the hospital, or if you need less physician visits, things like that, those are potential cost savings that could be associated with whatever the policy is about. Similarly, in a way that they, I think, often miss, although they do try, is the potential impact on the industry itself. So that is to say, what would the industry do in response to this policy? There can be many policies that have very direct impacts on potentially the pharmaceutical industry as a whole, or very specific pieces of it. And companies aren't going to just say, okay, great, and go on about their day. They want to know, how is this going to impact our specific business, and what are we going to do in response? CBO, I think, needs to incorporate more of that side into how these scores are going to play out. So a good example is with impacts to premiums in Part D, for example. If you increase costs to insurers, there's going to be some amount of increase in premiums, generally speaking. There's obviously exceptions within that, and there's a whole lot of complicated mechanics at play there, but the general idea generally holds true. They often don't really look at that side, or don't look at it to the extent that I think would be necessary to really capture the actual impact of the score. So aside from the actual offset piece, there's two additional ways that I think would be very beneficial. One of them is additional transparency on their methodology. So as Amanda said, they often put out just a score that's like a line, and it's numbers throughout 10 years, and that's all you get. You have no idea what they did to come up with these numbers, or what assumptions might have been made in order to reach those values. Now, obviously, they can't share every detail, because there can be things like confidential information involved. However, I think being able to share more about their overall methodology would improve both sides of the equation, and that we would like the industry as a whole would be able to better understand what they're thinking in order to then in the meetings with CBO have a more constructive conversation going into it rather than trying to find out what they're thinking in that initial meeting.
Brendan, we just had two questions come in. One of them is a deeper one that I think we're going to answer on the next question about, do we score based on the policy is written or the policy is being implemented and how that works? We're going to talk about that one on the next slide, I think, of what we actually are scoring. Another question just came in about the use of private data, and they're asking if you can talk about like when you use data from the companies versus when you use public data and what you try to balance.
Sure. So it's a balance. You definitely use a mixture of public and private data, and that does include confidential data from individual companies. So you can provide confidential data to CBO, specifying that it is confidential. They will not then share that data with anybody else. So that could include things like, sales projections and things like that, as a company, you might not want to be sharing with everybody in the world, but you can provide the information to CBO so that they can use that to more accurately reflect a score without having to worry about the confidentiality aspect. As a general rule, public data is the best option in terms of being able to share kind of the broadest information that might have the most acceptance throughout the industry. Obviously, not all public data is going to be something that everybody agrees with, but if you have individual papers, for example, that can be cited as saying, we did this research and this was the result, when you're using that kind of information in a score, it's just lends more credence to where that came from, and then either CBO or you as the company can then look into what the methodology was, and if there were flaws in it or specific aspects that you think need to be addressed, you can go from there. And I think that goes along with that like methodological transparency piece of the more you know about information that was used and how it was used going into a meeting with CBO, the more constructive that meeting can be.
Thank you. I'm going to hop to the next slide, and we're going to talk about an actual score and how it plays out. So Brendan and I can kind of walk you through, and I just got a question about offsets. I'll come right back to that question as well. So when you get a score, and if this doesn't answer this person's question about like, what are you actually scoring, let me know. But what we try to do first is number one, we define the policy in a couple different ways. So we build a model that's interactive. So we put a bunch of different levers down the side. That can be like policy is written, policy as we see it being implemented, what we think the CBO is going to think, and what we think is actually going to happen. So we're going to build all those different examples in there. But our goal is to sit down with the team, or if it's an association or if it's a patient group, we're going to sit down and say, what do you want the law to say? And how do you want it to change? Or have you figured, like, is your law already out there? Like, is your bill already out there and we're just scoring it? Or is it something that you're trying to figure out what you want to put in there? So we've had examples like recently a client wanted to put something in where every product at a certain under the Medicare specialty tier would get something. And we said, well, wait a minute, you would be kicking certain drugs out. You should take that language out, because if you do that, these certain drugs wouldn't be covered under this policy. So we went through the exercise to show them like the way it's written means this, but what this actually means is this. So we wanted to sit there and define the policy. I will say sometimes this is the toughest part, this little green box, because you'll get an association together that you have a lot of different companies that are coming together to think through the same ultimate goal of protecting their industry. But they're also individual companies with competitive products, and they all have different interests in the way things should go. So this sometimes I feel like you're the therapist on the call with the team trying to figure out, how do we want to define this? What if 7 different companies have several different points that they want to press, let's score each of them and see how they affect the policy. So we kind of build this like interactive score, and we make it very conversational and try to address everybody's points to see how it plays out. That way we're not, kicking certain people's opinions out or not giving weight to something that may actually really help a score. So that's the first thing, is trying to work with people. And then as you're coming up with that, you want to upfront put together an effective communication plan. So let's say you're a company with a very rare disease, or you're an association that covers a very, very rare disease. No one knows about your disease. You're about to put out a policy to open access to products for those patients. Maybe while we're doing a score, we think through like a quick 1-pager to go on the Hill that just highlights the burden of disease or the unmet need, or some state fact sheets to put in front of people in Congress to understand that here's who in your district is important, or in your state, or this one hospital is treating a huge amount of people because there's one physician in your area that is an expert in this disease. So you're trying to figure out how to start the communication about the policy even before you have the score as an educational point, but then you're also at the same time defining what you want the policy to be. So that's kind of the tough hill to jump over, right, is to figure it out. Then enters Brendan, where he's going to build the score the way we think CBO is going to do it, and then the way we think based on our understanding of the economy, our clients involved, and how they think things are going to go, how we think it's going to play out. So I'll let Brendan kind of talk about the way the score ends up looking.
Sure. So as you said, we always start from the standpoint of what we think CBO thinks. And that can, of course, be a little bit of a challenge. As we talked about previously, they don't always put out a lot of information about their methodology. So to some degree, it's going back through previous scores that they've released, trying to see if there's any similar policies that might have been scored, so that you can try to identify what their methodology may have been, or maybe they even shared information in that case. Or just generally keeping an eye on the trend of what they seem to be doing currently. CBO it's an office full of people, and the individual people change over time. So, somebody that puts out a score 2 years ago might not be the same people that are trying to put out a score today. So there is always some degree of evolution in their process. Like thinking more dynamically is a good example, where we've definitely seen over time they try to think more and more dynamically, whereas before it was mostly static. So starting from where CBO thinks, or at least where we think that they would think, we also look at things like best and worst case estimates. Kind of a sensitivity analysis type thing, where we want to see what is actually impacting the score for this policy specifically. A lot of policies aren't going to be as straightforward as your like the welcome to Medicaid visit, for example, where it's or welcome to Medicare. So where it was just basically there's this visit, it happens this many times, that's the cost. There's usually a lot more to dive into in terms of the dynamics of Part B or Part D or both, what's actually going to happen and how that plays out on the cost side, because these are obviously not the most straightforward systems in terms of how the costs happen. From there, once we have that kind of baseline, what we think CBO thinks kind of score, we also then work with a variety of assumptions, and this is where we start to make it more dynamic and interactive. So there's assumptions for pretty much anything that could potentially influence the score and isn't locked in based on existing policy or things like that. So we're not going to have an assumption about like how the Part D payment mechanisms work unless policy is trying to actually impact that mechanism. But we might have policies about, assumptions about utilization of various drugs that would be impacted by a policy, or even the number of enrollees within Part D, for example. So there's assumptions for all of that, and that's a lot of where we do the sensitivity analysis type work as well. As we talked about before, we base that on a combination of public and private data. Again, we try to use public when it's available, but private data definitely has its use too. That is mainly when you want to make sure that your specific situation or viewpoint, whatever the case may be, is going to be represented in a score. Public data is not always going to mesh with your specifics. So being able to have, for example, like this is what we think CBO would find on their own, and then we can have an alternative set of assumptions, at least for certain parameters, that would be, here's what people that we are representing say that it should be. And that opens you up to be able to have that conversation, to share that information with CBO and potentially influence their outlook on it as well. So when it comes to that, you want to be able to provide transparent information as much as possible. We make all of our assumptions adjustable. Even within an actual meeting with CBO, you might be changing a value on the fly so that you can see, okay, CBO thinks that this value should actually be something else. How does that impact the score that we developed? And just being able to make those adjustments very easily also supports the sensitivity analysis side of what is actually influencing this score. Is it all based on one assumption that we have little data for, or is it a variety of assumptions that we have a lot of data supporting, or somewhere in between? The less certainty you have on those main factors, the more I think it's important to explore the sensitivity side and see how much that score could potentially change if your assumption isn't exactly what plays out. I think that's very important in your discussion with CBO to be able to say, our score is, let's say, $500 million over 10 years. But if this assumption is different, if we got it too low, then the score is going to be 700 million over 10 years. Or if we got it too high, it's going to be 300 million over 10 years, things like that. Just being able to go into those conversations with as much information about that stuff as possible is very helpful.
Yeah, I know it sounds corny, but there's vulnerability you have to show to the CBO, right? You have to show them that you understand the way things could go. And there is, as Brendan said, some ranges. So if you go in with, we think it's this, and it's only this, so nothing's going to happen, you're not always going to be met with a discussion. They're just going to listen to you, nod their heads and be done. But if you go in and say, there's some ways that this could play out, and here's the range of the way the score could be because of these economic issues, what do you all think about it? And you're starting a more conversational meeting with them, you're likely to get more out of it and understand their thinking. And then that lets you adjust your score or adjust your thinking or how you might want to frame up the policy. I just had a great question come in on, what's CBO's receptivity to interacting with subject matter experts. I think you're in a really good shape when you go in a meeting with them and you have, let's say there's a client company or an association and they have the intro and then they turn the discussion over to a technical person and then a subject matter expert. You could add another person, a physician, or another person who's really involved in a topic and bring that person to the meeting. I don't think you're going to do much if you put a heartfelt bow on something, but if you go in and really talk to the economics of something, I think that is helpful to do. One of the things that we also try to say to them is, for my example, I cover every topic in Medicare, right? But if I'm working with a company with a drug in one distinctive area, that company knows that drug better than anybody else, right? The people who work at that company know their policy issues. So we try to learn as much as we can from them so that when we're talking and we're showing our thoughts and showing the experts or the subject matter expertise, we're also trying to relay what we've learned from our member company. It's all a very interactive process. So when we get in front of them, the score sounds like, yes, everybody in this room agrees that this is the way the economics are. Add in another person to add to that, that's great. But you're going in with a very solid single message to them based on everyone's agreement that you've got in that green box up there that took a long time to get. So I think that's really, really important and a great question. Thank you. And then the other question that came in is, what is this score really? I mean, I didn't do all the, like, please excuse my dear Aunt Sally with all the parentheses in here, but this is really just, we're thinking of it more as a regression model, right? Instead of just X times Y, we're thinking of X times Y plus the interaction of X and Y plus Z plus the interaction. You know, it's just a much more complicated way that we're trying to get them to think. And we have a couple examples at the end that some of them very frustrating that I think really show where we've had to really push back on CBO in some meetings to share our thoughts on the way things will actually work. So thank you for those great questions. Keep them coming. All right, so meeting with CBO. So the way that I discuss this is you gotta walk in and play nice. I know it can be really frustrating, and there's certain people, they come in hot in a meeting and they're gonna have an opinion. I had a really aggressive meeting with them a couple of weeks ago. A month before that, I had a very pleasant meeting with them. So they are going to come into a meeting with their own opinions. So the way I recommend is you just come in as we're trying to partner with you, and we're trying to show you and discuss information with you. We're going to have a whole script prepared beforehand so no one goes off script. And we're going to walk through our thoughts on this. And you will get the person in the room who's going to want to put a gotcha question out there. They're going to want to ask that question. They're going to want to get you. That's why before the meeting, we try to prepare and understand what are they going to ask us. So what reports do we think they've seen? If they ask us this, what do we want to have as our background? And if they ask a gotcha question that we can't answer, don't try to answer it. Say, you know what, that's a really interesting point. Let's get back to you in a follow-up, email or meeting. That's going to definitely open up the doors. I also recommend to a lot of our clients, email the score to them when you're done, make a score. So when we've gone through the process that we just talked about here, we've completed a score. This is all internal between us and the client. And then we're going to figure out what do we want to put in front of CBO and actually share in the meeting. So then we're going to then pull together the public facing or the CBO facing model that's got our favorite sensitivity analysis, the way we think it's going to go. So we're going to make a technical memo. We're going to do a Hill briefing. We're going to share this with them. And we're also going to be comfortable in a lot of cases sharing the score. So I think that's an important thing, is to just go in expecting to be as transparent as you can be with them, to be comfortable. They're going to listen to you more. And I've also seen cases where we've shared a model. They've come back and asked to talk to us. We've gone through a model with them. We've had really good dialogue and we've learned more about what they're thinking. So I think it's really helpful to try to do that transparent approach. And then sometimes in a meeting, they're going to give you feedback. And they're not going to like the way you thought through something, and you're going to disagree with them. And I think if you can leverage their information to adjust the CBO score, right? We've built a CBO thinking score and we've built our own score. That gives you the ability to go back and adjust the assumptions that you think they're using. But then it also gives you a chance to say, yeah, but they're wrong, and we need to show this, this, and this. So it helps you adjust your score if you have that back and forth in that discussion. I've had, and I'll just go ahead and skip to the crazy one I had. When the IRA first passed, I met with CBO, and they didn't believe that the IRA was going to increase Medicare premiums. They didn't think Part D premiums would go up. And their agreement or their discussion with me was, if the Part D plan wants to remain competitive, they will not raise the premiums because they still want healthy enrollees. And I'm thinking premiums, rebates, all those things lead to the premium, right? At the end of the year, all those things come together to get to the margin that the plan's expecting to make. You can't, as we all say, squeeze the balloon at one end and take away and, negotiate drugs, put them at more a higher percent of cost sharing at the plan, and not expect them to either go to the manufacturer and ask for more rebate or increase premiums. We had a whole discussion around that, a whole thing. And they scored the IRA, and I have never been able to replicate the score. I have tried because I don't think that they thought premiums would change. And then, holy moly, guys, look what happened last year. Premiums skyrocketed. And then they came out with a demonstration project to cover Part D plans losing their funds, right? They're losing their shirts. So they had to come in and supplement that. So when CBO comes out with their Medicare baseline for this year, I guarantee you they're going to have some premium impact in there that they weren't thinking up front. So that conversation just like still my jaw just drops every time I think about that. But think about the way they're thinking about it, right? They're seeing over time, premiums haven't changed that much, even though the donut hole came and we fixed that and this and that. And it's not really going to change because they just want healthy enrollees. Heck no, that's not how it works, right? So getting in a room and discussing that and trying to have that dialogue with them and bringing experts to the table is really important. But then you go back and you adjust your CBO score, then you are looking at your score, and then your whole mission is this green box at the bottom to develop supplemental materials that you're putting out to say, CBO, you should be thinking about it this way, or you should be considering this, or premiums will change. Here's a bunch of actuaries and their quotes from market research we've done, right? So now you're getting the information from them to influence and change the way the score is playing out. And also, I've had plenty of times in meetings with CBO where they have said something that you had no clue they were thinking that way. You cannot exactly get to a score that they have because they don't share the information as Brendan has highlighted. So you're trying to get all these nuggets from them to replicate their score down to the dollar, right? You're trying to get all those pieces of information. So take that and put that into your scores and take every meeting and interaction with them as a learning experience for this bill, right, that you're working on or this issue and beyond. So Brendan, do you have anything you want to add to this slide?
No, I think you covered it well.
Anyone who works with me knows that I get very giddy talking about this. So I've probably said it all today, sorry. So great. So we're going to talk through some CBO examples of where do we think they got it right and where do they think they got it wrong. So I'll just highlight that middle one that I just talked about. This can be the one that still just blows my mind, was the discussion that, you know, we saw significantly higher costs from the IRA just because they didn't necessarily think premiums were going to rise. I think that was a huge miss, a huge discussion point. I'm sure several of you on this call, either in the plan side of things or the manufacturer side of things, would have been able to economically argue that discussion with them. But that was a very solid point that they were holding on to. So Brendan, do you want to talk to the blue and the green?
Sure. So I guess starting with the annual projection side, we've mentioned the CBO baselines a few times, I think. So these are their annual spending baseline information that they release at least roughly once a year. Timing always changes a little bit, but these are broken down into individual categories. So as one example, there's a federal spending for Medicare baseline. In those, they are generally speaking fairly accurate. There's always going to be some level of variation over time. We can't obviously predict everything that's going to happen over the course of a year. So there are definitely changes that happen with each of these baselines. But just as a quick example, between 2020 and 2022, their projections for Medicare spending were pretty accurate. Little variations, but generally speaking, remained pretty consistent. In 2023, on the other hand, they were projecting that the net federal subsidies for Medicare would be around 130 billion over 10 years, which I should specify they always look at these scores over the course of 10 years. So they thought it was going to be about 130 billion. However, by the time they released the 2024 baseline, it showed that the actual federal subsidies in 2023 were more like 825 billion. So that's just a little bit off. Things changed, obviously, and there's aspects of things that they obviously didn't predict correctly. But they can absolutely get those things wrong, but then they do update to the best of their ability in further baselines to reflect the changes that have happened. And then on the other side, as far as the pipeline estimates, this is very much still a TBD thing, but based on changes that have come in through the IRA, and obviously there's going to be other things that could potentially impact this as well. But they have projected that there would be 13 fewer drugs entering the market over the next 30 years due to the IRA specifically. Some critics have definitely said that's way underestimating it. They think that the impact is actually going to be more like 135 fewer drugs, and that's just through 2039, not even 30 years. So it's a big difference. Others, on the other hand, think that it's going to have very little impact, looking at it from the side of, yes, there's a reduction in money that's coming into the companies, but that's not going to meaningfully shift their overall investment strategy in their development process. Time will tell on this one. We'll see for sure, but it's definitely something I want to keep an eye on.
Thanks. I think one of the interesting things on this green box too is not just necessarily how the pipeline is going to change, but the order of drug launches, for example. So we're in an industry right now where you've seen so many rare disease products and orphan disease products come out recently, but now clients could be penalized for launching those products earlier. So are we not just going to see a pipeline change, but just delay in launch of products for these types of indications? So the economic impact goes even so much further beyond just what's going to come to market. It's even if it does come to market, when and are we going to see access change? So I think that's just a really, really interesting one that they've kind of thought a little bit less on. So yeah, thank you, Brendan, on that. So we're going to pause and see if there's any questions or discussion points people want to raise. But I was just hoping that this gives you all a perspective of trying to interact with the agency or with the office a little bit more in a transparent way, feeling comfortable going in and saying, we're not quite understanding the score. This is the way we've thought about it. How to handle those meetings. I think really getting that script and working with those people up front is very important to that. So hopefully this has been helpful and can help lead to more effective communication. I would say I am very much a transparent person with CBO. I recommend the same with OMB, CMS, every agency, just because I think they need to learn more about the way that our industry does work and how it all plays out. And they need to hear consistent messages from different stakeholders, right? No matter who's in there, everyone knows the way on this phone or on this call, how changing a drug cost is going to affect a premium, right? So whether you're a PBM, a plan, a manufacturer, a patient group, we can all talk to those things. And I think having that consistent messaging is very important. So any other questions that anybody has before we wrap up? Okay, I think that's it. I am happy to, we're going to put up the recording of this and the slides, and then we are happy to answer any other questions. If anybody would like to reach out to us afterward, thank you for the wonderful questions along the way. Just so you know, as I mentioned, next month, we are going to focus on tariffs and pricing policies and kind of what we're going to see play out in the next couple weeks. We will be joined by Chris Schott, who works very closely with us on a lot of projects like this. He's a drug pricing attorney, works at Latham & Watkins, and he's wonderful if you've met him or worked with him before. So he'll be joining us, and we'll have kind of a panel discussion. We would love to hear questions. We'll probably do some fun stuff ahead of time and maybe see if people want to send questions before that we can address on the panel, because I think we're all in the same boat of just trying to figure out what is going on in this world. So I hope you all have a wonderful holiday weekend. Thank you all so much for joining us, and have a great rest of your day.